Hey guys, my name is Kirk Veldman, and my topic for the video bios is Colonel Edward House. Colonel House was born in Houston, Texas on July 26th, 1858. He is the son of an English immigrant and prominent Texas and Confederate businessman. So he was born and remained wealthy. His dad was one of the wealthiest businessmen in the state and the country, in fact. Um, he was the youngest of seven boys. He attended various schools throughout his youth. He lived in England for a while, actually, so he went to an English prep school. He went to prep schools around the United States, and he eventually ended up at Cornell University. But he ended up dropping out due to his father's poor health and eventual passing. And once his dad died, he decided that he didn't want to go back and finish his degree. He was just going to take over his father's estate, and that's how he ended up making money the rest of his life. He began to invest in banking as well. Um, but yeah, managing his father's estate was primarily what he survived off of. But yeah, like I said, dabbled a little bit inside investments as well. But never finishing college did have some consequences. He wasn't really trained for any specific career, so he began to pour himself into politics. Um, and so his political career really took off in earnest after his dad died and he inherited the estate. He began to really read widely on the subject, excuse me. And so in Texas, that's really where he got to start. He got to know all the major players. His father's wealth certainly helped him to get in the door, but his skills and his reading and his background took over from there. So before he really got started, though, he had to do a bit of soul searching because he realized that he would never be good in the spotlight. He realized that he would function best in an advisory role. This is for several reasons. One was because he was not a very gifted public speaker. He was also just sickly and diminutive. He was a small guy. He was not the striking figure that politicians seek to be sure. So he decided that he would settle into being the hidden hand behind politicians, and he became really effective in politics in that role. Between 1892 and 1902, he actually managed four gubernatorial campaigns, all of which were successful, and in each he subsequently served as an advisor. It was actually from his service to James S. Hogg in Texas, the governor of Texas, that he received his honorary title of colonel, which became his preferred moniker for the rest of his life, despite never serving in the military. So he's becoming more and more well known in the political sphere. He still hasn't come up to the national stage, but he's had a pretty rapid rise in Texas politics. And he had a house in New York, and the Wilson campaign came calling around this time. When they came calling, it was said that House had the entire state of Texas in his pocket. This is he was even like his role was that of a kingmaker. Um, Here we have House right here, and it was because of his wealth and political clout that the campaign sought him out. His clout was a bit over exaggerated. Um, his role as kingmaker was, I mean, winning four campaigns helps, but like I said, it was a bit overstated. Um, with their initial meeting, House he impressed the campaign staff, but he didn't jump on board right away. He nominally supported what Wilson stood for. Obviously, he was a lifelong Democrat and progressive, so he had interest. But what really skyrocketed the relationship with Wilson himself was a meeting with Wilson in November of 1911. Him and Wilson at this meeting became fast friends virtually after a single hour. They had similar backgrounds. They were both born in the South, House in Texas, Wilson in Georgia, and so they had a distaste for Reconstruction because of that, and carpetbaggers and all the stuff that came with Reconstruction. Um, their worldviews are remarkably similar as well. Both were committed social Darwinists. They were committed to the idea of American exceptionalism. They had almost identical views on Anglo-Saxon and Western civilization superiority in the world. This is going to become really important later when you talk about the mandate system and League of Nations and stuff like that. So it also helped that both men attended elite schools. Wilson was obviously the better scholar and student, House never applied himself as much as he could have. It wasn't that he was incapable, but he was not the top of his class. However, they both got a lot of out of their educations, and their education was deeply formative on their worldviews. So after this meeting, House was totally on board. But as I mentioned earlier, he was a sickly man his entire life, and he actually came down with a pretty bad fever before he could begin working in earnest for the Wilson campaign. So during this time, he actually wrote a dystopian novel of all things. It was titled Philip Dru, Administrator, and it was kind of his like magnum opus, or like his laying out of his political ideology. And what the novel essentially does is walk through the United States where the East and West are fighting, and he ends it, which is fitting for a relationship with Wilson, by writing each of the 50 states rewritten constitutions. And so it's really no wonder why Wilson thought of him as a second personality. As we know, Wilson was devoted to writing constitutions his entire life. But once he recovered, he was virtually inseparable from Wilson. Here's a picture of Wilson with his Kingmaker. Wilson, obviously, as we know, run the presidency. House's support certainly helped. He brought in valuable Texan connections and, importantly, donors. It wasn't the reason why Wilson won, but it certainly helped quite a bit. And with Wilson winning, House got to stay on as an unofficial advisor and diplomat. One of the most remarkable things about Colonel House, his political career, he never had any official significant role. He was always just an advisor, and he served in an unpaid, unofficial kind of background role. He held a lot of power for being a background guy, that's for sure. During this time, he was Wilson's closest confidant. I mean, they did everything together. They even talked about members of cabinet in code through phone calls and telegrams. House actually helped pick the cabinet with Wilson. Wilson would play the names off of House and see how House reacted. He also played more roles than that. In at least one case, money was transferred through him to ambassadors to shore up their required entertaining funds. So back then, you had to be a pretty rich dude to be an ambassador, because you had to entertain the people on your dollar. And so some of these ambassadors ran out of money, and they just used Colonel House to give him a little boost. House was particularly interested in foreign policy, and he became an expert in it. And this became particularly helpful in the First World War when it erupted. Wilson actually sent House to go act basically as his eyes and ears among the Allied nations, especially in London, a little bit in Paris as well. But his role eventually started causing some strife in the cabinet, because you have an unofficial diplomat basically who's only approved by Wilson. He wasn't elected, he wasn't approved by Congress, all that stuff. And so William Jennings Bryan, this wasn't the primary reason he resigned, but when he did, he cited House as functioning as the Secretary of State, not him, which is pretty significant. Like, the Secretary of State's pretty high; it's the highest member of cabinet, and he saw House as being Wilson's closest advisor and functioning as a paid official state diplomat when he wasn't. One of probably the most famous work in foreign affairs that House performed was the House-Gray Memorandum in 1916, which is a massively important document. Despite his unofficial role, he promised that if Germany didn't come to the peace table, the United States would enter the war on the side of the Allies. So here we have, like I said, unpaid, unofficial diplomat speaking out of his own mind for President Wilson. He's, like, House isn't elected by the people, he's not approved by Congress, but he's promising that the United States is going to go to war. It's a pretty egregious overstep of protocol from the Wilson administration. He also headed an intelligence think tank known as the Inquiry. It operated in secret and existed to feel out what a post-war world would look like, and how colonies were going to deal with the defeated. How the Allied countries are going to deal with the defeated colonies of the Axis powers. It was this organization of experts that actually began to lay out what became known as the Mandate System that was adopted by the League of Nations. So the Mandate System, basically what Wilson and House wanted to do was to reform the colonialist practices of Europe, and reform the whole colonial system. So obviously, right off the bat, Britain and France and South Africa actually weren't on board because they all wanted to keep their colonies. South Africa wanted to expand, actually. So what Wilson and House had to do was really ramp up their rhetoric, and they had to really wrap this thing in a way that would be accepted by all the Allied powers. And so what they, instead of the colonial overlords in the system, what Wilson and House called them was, what Wilson and House called the governing states were trustees. So in the mandate system, these trustees would ensure indigenous rights and economic free trade. And in practice, they basically functioned as colonial overlords. But with this rhetoric, it sounded better to Wilson and House, at least. An interesting point is that both George Beer, who was House's lieutenant in the inquiry, and himself, and Colonel House himself, while they were rhetorically denounced colonialism, in practice they were just reviving it. They were actually recorded saying that they feared giving the natives in Africa political, military, and economic freedom because they thought them too stupid and too dangerous to act well in international relations. This also comes up when we see that there were workable alternatives in Africa, and with the whole colonial oversight, all that stuff. W.E.B. Du Bois actually proposed an independent Central African state composed of the former German colonies and the Belgian colonies as well. But he wasn't given the time of day. Wilson and House, we have to look at Wilson and House's racist backgrounds here, because the system aligned with African interests. It fit the model that House and the Inquiry had put together, but it was rejected as being too liberal. So the question has to be asked: why did they reject it if it fit all the stuff they were looking for? It has their Southern backgrounds, their social Darwinist backgrounds, all of that stuff played into them denying that opportunity for the African Free State. So, like I said, while espousing national self-determinism, spouting all this rhetoric, the ideals put forward by House and Wilson were just that, ideals, and they were never lived up to. So essentially that's how the Brits and the French could sign on to such policies, that they knew they would still have oversight. And so what came up was the final mandate system looked like this. There was 3 tiers. There was the A countries, the B countries, and the C countries. The A countries were very close to being ready to govern themselves. They didn't need long oversight by the League of Nations. The B countries needed a bit longer of oversight. Then they would be assigned a trustee country from within the League of Nations who would enforce demilitarization, prohibition of illegal slave, alcohol, and arms trades. And then the C countries were virtually the same as the B countries, but with more restrictions and longer oversight periods. And Wilson approved of this system. House played the key role in negotiating for it. And it really does show their true leanings towards imperialism, American-style imperialism. House knew going in that there are a few countries likely to receive A mandates, and like the mandate system was just colonial overlordship wrapped in flowery language, and it got passed. It got approved by all the league states, and House was named the American representative to the Mandates Commission. This kind of started the famous Wilson and House breakup. There's a couple reasons why it's said to have happened, but the primary reason is, this was a picture of the Paris Peace Conference. The primary reason was Woodrow and Edith. Edith was not a fan of House at all. She didn't loathe him like a lot of people say, but she definitely did not like him or his wife, didn't like that they had to go to dinner with them and all that stuff. And she felt threatened actually by Colonel House, according to most people. She wanted to be Wilson's closest advisor and friend, and she felt that House was. And so she was always questioning his loyalty to Wilson and all that stuff. Regardless of what happened, what caused it, there was a massive break in their relationship, and Edward House, former best friend and closest advisor to President Wilson, was no longer in that role. They they have a full and problematic legacy. Indeed, their final days were not amicable. Wilson still trusted him as his emissary in charge of colonial policy, but they definitely didn't see eye to eye anymore in terms of friendship. And in fact, when House went to London to go participate as the colonial emissary, and Woodrow Wilson went back to the United States, that was the last time they ever saw each other. After the passing of the Wilson administration and Wilson himself, House largely remained out of official politics. He chose to instead just advocate publicly for certain policies like American membership in the League of Nations, which ironically America never joined. And he lived out the rest of his days in New York and Texas. He died on March 28th, 1938 in New York. And like I said, left behind a full, albeit problematic legacy of American imperialism abroad. So that is Colonel House. Thanks for watching.